Hello, dear students. How are you today? All right. In the last session, we have completed nervous system part 1. Now we are in part 2. Let us continue this topic. All right. So, let's get started. Okay, so in the last session, we were in the human nervous system. We read about human nervous system. We just got the little bit idea of what is nervous system. All right, so human nervous system is divided into two main parts, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Okay, so central nervous system, when I talk about it, consists of only brain and spinal cord, nothing apart from these two, nothing is there. All right, so peripheral nervous systems are the nerves that arises from the brain and the spinal cord. Periphery means towards, away from the center, okay, towards the periphery. So it contains all the nerves that arises from the brain and the spinal cord. All right. Now, we have seen the difference also, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, where it in central nervous system, or we can call it CNS. It includes brain and spinal cord. It is situated in mid-dorsal axis of the body, and it has various center for regulation and coordination of the body's function. Remember, we learned about the coordination in the last this session. Yes, so coordination is controlled by central nervous system. Okay, peripheral nervous system, which includes the cranial nerves and spinal nerves that arises from the brain and the spinal cord. It is spread in the peripheral region, end part of the organ. It regulates systemic system, skeletal muscles, skin, joints. It controls involuntary activities of the organs. Okay, let's move now. If I go in detail, what is central nervous system and peripheral nervous system? So peripheral nervous, we learned about central nervous system. It consists of only brain and spinal cord, but peripheral nervous system, there is something more. Peripheral nervous system, it is made up of thick bundles of axons called the nerves also. If I in the last session, where when you go through the last session, then you will get to know, or you will get the clear idea of what are nerves, okay, and how we can call the nerve as a bundle of axons that carry the messages back and forth between CNS and muscles, organs and senses in the periphery of the body. That is everything outside the CNS. It carries the messages outside the CNS, okay. PNS, or the peripheral nervous system, has two major subdivisions, that are somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. Okay, so these the division of the peripheral nervous system, somatic and autonomic nervous system, there is something more about it. Let's get to know in detail. Now, if I give you the flow chart of the nervous system, it's very easy for you to remember, since now by now we know the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. That nervous system is divided into two, central and peripheral, CNS or PNS. Now central, where it consists of spinal cord and brain. Peripheral nervous system, there is something more, that is autonomic and somatic nervous system. Now autonomic nervous system interacts with the internal autonomic, okay. Autonomic, you can remember this word with by relating with the word of automatic, the organs that needs to work automatically. All right, that do not require our involvement, so that regularly working automatically. So autonomous nervous system interacts with the organs or the glands, the nerves that interacts with the organs or the gland. Now somatic nervous system interacts with the somatic, S for somatic and S for senses, okay. Sensory means in our control, and voluntary muscles means the muscles which are in our control, that they are not automatic, they are controlled by us, that means consciousness, okay. So autonomic nervous system and somatic somatic nervous system, the nerves that interact with the internal environment, and here somatic nervous system, the nerves that interact with the sensory organ and voluntary muscles. Now autonomic nervous system, again it has the two main subdivisions, which are called sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. Now sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, there is something more about it. We'll get to know this in the later very soon actually. And somatic nervous system subdivided into sensory and motor. So sensory and motor nerves, so we already know this, sensory and motor nerves. Sensory means that senses and senses the environment, external environment, sends the messages to the internal environment, that means the spinal cord or the brain, or motor nervous system, from the messages coming from the brain or the spinal cord to the outer environment. All right, so the brain and the spinal cord comes under the central nervous system, where the brain controls how we think, learn, move and feel. The spinal cord carries the messages back and forth between the brain and the nerves that run throughout the body. Means the spinal cord is the link between the brain and the peripheral, we can say peripheral nervous system. Now tell me, one question is here, that why the brain and the spinal cord are called the central nervous system? Now this is a very important question and very easy also. All right, so one of the reason I can tell you that it is situated in the mid dorsal region of the body, correct? So that is why we can call it brain and the spinal cord. And also it is the master or the monitor or the controller of all the nerves. The brain only, the spinal cord only, the brain controls how we think, learn, move and feel. The spinal cord carries the messages back and forth. Okay, so here it controls each and everything, that is why it is central nervous system. And so on an average, an adult human brain weighs about 1.5 kg. Yes, adult human brain weighs about 1.5 kg, and it is contained or it is protected in a bony structure which is called skull or cranium. Yes, the soft part of the brain, the soft part of the central nervous system and the spinal cord, it is protected. The brain is protected under the skull, and the spinal cord is protected in the vertebral column, right? Yesterday in the last session also I discussed that it is protected under vertebral column, and that is why we humans known as vertebrates, correct? Okay, now let's move to the another one, which is the brain. Now let's get in detail about the brain, that it is very complex and important organ. Yes, of course it is very important organ of our body. Any damage, one of the interesting fact, any damage in the brain is the permanent damage and it cannot recover. All right, an adult human weighs about 1.5 kg, human brain actually, and it is contained in bony structure called the skull or the cranium. It is enclosed in the three protective membranes called the meninges. All right, it is called the meninges. Three membranes are there. Okay, three membranes are there, and these membranes are called the meninges, and each meninges is separated by the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, in between the meninges there is a fluid which is filled with, and that is why it gets the protection. All right, so our brain is divided into three main parts: cerebrum, cerebellum and medulla oblongata. So cerebrum is different, cerebellum is different, and medulla oblongata. If I tell you that cerebrum, the first part, the major portion is taken by cerebrum only. Cerebellum is the smallest, the leaf shaped structure, and the medulla oblongata that runs continues as the spinal cord. Now let's move ahead and okay, so this is the diagram of the brain, and in the previous slide we learned that brain is divided into three main parts, which is cerebrum, cerebellum and medulla oblongata. Now here you are seeing cerebral hemisphere. I'll tell you that cerebrum is the most occupied area of the brain, so that is why it is being divided into two halves, okay, right and left. All right, so we have right cerebral hemisphere, we have left cerebral hemisphere. When we see from the back, we have right cerebral hemisphere and we have left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so and then the second one is cerebellum. Cerebellum is the leaf-like structure that is situated just behind the brain, when we touch the neck portion, that is the cerebellum, and downward portion just below it runs the medulla oblongata, and medulla oblongata only continues as the spinal cord, but the upper portion, it is called the medulla oblongata. Now these three names you need not to study, because it is not included in this syllabus. So we will, of course, we will go through the word, that is hypothalamus, pituitary and midbrain. Here it is the midbrain. Okay, hypothalamus and pituitary comes under the endocrine gland. Now let's move ahead. Okay, so I told you in the last session that bring the walnut or keep the picture of walnut with you, so that we can relate or compare our brain. All right, so I talked about the cerebral hemisphere, that cerebrum is divided into two hemisphere, just like as you see the walnut, how the walnut, it is placed, when it is placed in the shell, it has two halves. All right, so when you break the walnut shell, then you will find the walnut shell into two halves. So similarly, our brain is like that. So it has two halves, which is called right and left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so it is the largest portion of the brain, the major occupied area of the brain. It has two cerebral hemisphere, outer surface folded in the ridges and grooves to accommodate large number of the neuron. Now see, when you see the walnut, how it has formed the ridges and the grooves, just like that cerebrum forms the ridges and the grooves. Okay, ridges and the grooves. Why ridges and the grooves are formed? So that to increase the surface area. Now what is there, what is the need of increasing the surface area when in the brain? So that it can accommodate large number of neurons. All right, neurons, the nerve cell, the single cell that we have read. So it has large number of neurons. So now here is the fact that human cerebrum consists of about 9 billion neurons. All right, 9 billion neurons. You just imagine how many neurons it is when you convert it into lakhs or thousands. Okay, now what is the function of the cerebrum? It is a seat of intelligence. Yes, of course, or your intelligence, your IQ comes from this area only. Your consciousness, willpower, and it controls all your voluntary activities. Suppose you are going to read, you're going to study, you're going to play, everything, all the voluntary activities, you're going to eat, all your voluntary activities is controlled by cerebellum. Now let's move to the next one, which is the cerebellum. Now cerebellum, it is much smaller and located under the cerebrum. Its function is that it helps in balancing of the body, coordinate the muscular activities. Yes, of course, our sitting posture, our standing posture, our movement, okay, when we are walking, when we are moving, everything is controlled by cerebellum, because it is the balance controller. All right, it controls the balance of the body. It implements the action decided by the cerebrum. Cerebrum is thinking. Okay, cerebrum means if when the cerebrum is thinking that you need to stand, and but after standing, what gives you the balance? Cerebellum gives you the balance. Okay, so now the third point is that it contains about 80% of the neuron of the brain. All right, where the cerebrum contains the major 9 billion neurons, it contains cerebellum also having the 80% of the neurons of the brain. Okay, cerebellum is the little brain, we can say. All right, it helps in the coordination of the balancing of the body. It controls the posture. It is involved in the motor learning. All right. Now, so let's move to the next one, medulla oblongata. Now, what medulla oblongata was the third part of the brain that we saw. Okay, so it is the lowest part and continues down as the spinal cord. Now, what is the function? That it controls the activities of the internal organ. All right, so medulla oblongata now here involved in the involuntary actions like beating of the heart, breathing, swallowing, digestion, sneezing, and many more things. Okay, digestion, respiration, excretion, everything it is controlled by medulla oblongata. Injury can cause death of a person. So injury, sudden injury or any injury, I already told you that any injury or any damage is not recoverable, non-recoverable. All right, so medulla oblongata also it can cause death of a person. All right, now the spinal cord. After the brain, we come to the spinal cord of the central nervous system. Here it extends from medulla and runs down almost throughout the whole length of the backbone. Okay, here it is the spinal cord that is situated, that is embedded in the vertebral column, and it runs throughout whole length of the backbone. Functions, what are the function? It controls the reflexes below the neck. Okay, what are the reflexes below the neck? Suppose when you touch, you have heard that touching of the hot object, you just remove your hand first, and then what you do, you get the signal that, oh yes, you got burn mark or you got burn. All right, so that kind of reflexes is controlled by the spinal cord. It conducts the messages from the muscle to brain, and sometimes it conducts the messages from the brain to the muscle of the trunk and the limbs, and sometimes it gives the command without sending the messages to the brain. All right, so this is all about spinal cord. Now we learned about central nervous system. Okay, now here we are coming to somatic nervous system. Okay, somatic nervous system comes under the peripheral nervous system. So peripheral nervous system is divided into two main parts, somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. Somatic nervous system means it is also involved in the voluntary actions. It consists of the nerves that arises from the cranial nerve, that arises from the cranial and the spinal cord. Okay, it connects the CNS to the muscles, organs, and the skin. Okay, in the first picture you see the central nervous system, the brain having millions of the nerves. So these are called the cranial nerves, and the spinal cord, the nerves arising from the spinal cord, you see, will be called as a spinal nerve. It is involved in the relay of sensory and motor information to and fro from the CNS. Therefore, it consists of the motor and the sensory neuron. Now, relaying of the messages means relaying of the messages, passing of the messages from one nerve to the another. All right, so as to complete the circuit, or so as to complete the information, means sending the information and bringing the information back to respond. Okay, so here voluntary and involuntary. If I talk about voluntary activities and involuntary activities, so voluntary activities, all those activities that are performed according to your will, as per your wish. So this involved your thinking, your consciousness. Okay, but the involuntary activities that is happening in our body, such as pumping of the heart, okay, blood pumping of the heart, digestion, excretion, okay, and many respiration. All right, so many things that are going inside our body, and those are called the involuntary. Why? Because they are not under control of our will. Okay, so voluntary action, when an action is produced with the involvement of the thoughts, they are called voluntary action. For example, writing an article, when you are writing anything, jumping from heights, for example, long jumps, high jumps. All right, these actions are produced consciously by our bodies. Involuntary actions that take place without consciousness or willingness of an individual are called involuntary action. So digestion, heart beating, sneezing, etc. are few examples. Okay, so let's move to the another slide, which is central nervous system. See the central nervous system, how it is connected with the internal nervous, internal environment and the external environment. See, from the external environment, sensory neuron sends the messages, goes to the brain or the this spinal cord, and then this again send the messages back. Okay, send the message back through the somatic nervous system, means the somatic nervous system for the voluntary action. Now here for the involuntary action, the autonomic nervous system, automatic, the organs that are running automatically, they are from the internal environment, and so sensory neurons are also present there, that sends the messages from the internal environment or from the internal organs to the brain or the spinal cord. Now autonomic nervous system having the motor neurons too, and they sends the response back from the brain to the organs. All right, so this is the pathway that I have explained to you. So autonomic nervous system, yes, of course it is involved in the involuntary activity. Autonomic nervous system, a control system that acts largely unconsciously and responsible for regulating involuntary bodily functions such as heart rate, its force of contraction, digestion, respiratory rate, and pupillary response. Consists of a pair of chains of ganglia. Pair of ganglia means a small dot of the nerve cells, the clusters of the nerve cells, nerves found on either side of the spinal cord. On either side of the spinal cord, you will see a small dot, that is called the ganglia, and this is nothing but the mass of nerve cell. Okay, and from here only the neurons are there, and neuron sends the messages and receives the messages. All right, can be further subdivided. Now autonomic nervous system divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which are antagonistic in action. All right, antagonistic means they work in contrast. If the sympathetic nervous system dilates the pupil, then parasympathetic nervous system parasympathetic nervous system now brings it back to the normal position. All right, if the sympathetic nervous system increases the heartbeat, parasympathetic nervous system then brings the condition back normal. All right, so central nervous system. Okay, so this diagram we have already done, so we can skip this, and here parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. See here, sympathetic nervous system, where you get the vigorous activity, you get the more of activities, more of the awareness, so that you can play, you can be awake. But parasympathetic brings you or calms you down. Parasympathetic, where the heartbeats, it makes you slower. Sympathetic, it makes the heartbeat becomes faster. All right, autonomic nervous system, here parasympathetic is flight or fight response. Okay, but sympathetic here gives you relaxation feeling. Parasympathetic gives you relaxation feeling. All right, so here the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system, it increases the arterial blood pressure, whereas parasympathetic decreases it. Sympathetic constricts the blood vessel, whereas parasympathetic dilates it. Sympathetic dilates the pupil of the eye, whereas it constricts the pupil of the eye. It retards the peristalsis movement. It accelerates the parasympathetic. What it does, it accelerates the peristalsis movement. You know, peristalsis movement that we can see in the esophagus and the stomach also having the peristalsis movement. So these are the things here. So some of the more differences from the sympathetic and nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. I hope you can read it and take a picture, take a screenshot, so that you can have the general idea, you can have the idea more in detail when you get through this. All right, so this is the all about central nervous system as well as peripheral nervous system. So central nervous system we have covered CNS, we have covered brain and the spinal cord, whereas parasympathetic nervous system we have covered somatic and autonomic nervous system, and your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So this is one of the slide where reflex action of the hand is shown, how the reflex action. So here spinal cord only takes the decision, it does not send the decision to the brain, because then it will be too delay and you will get burned. So before getting the sense of burning, you remove your hand because of the messages that is sent by the spinal cord. So this is the reflex action of your hand. All right, so thank you very much. I hope you liked the video. All right, so we'll meet in the next chapter, in the next session, in the next video. Thank you so much. Bye bye, take care.